Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I wish I could say I walked into that party with nothing but joy in my chest and excitement on my face, but anyone who's ever been the designated black sheep in their family knows better than to let hope run wild without a leash. I'd told myself I was ready for whatever came, rehearsed my smile in the bathroom mirror, double-checked my lipstick, and reminded myself that tonight wasn't about proving anything. It was supposed to be about love, about celebration, about me and Daniel stepping into a new chapter with the people who are supposed to care about us most. But if there's one thing I've learned about my mother over the years, it's that she has a gift for turning joy into obligation, praise into performance, and milestones into perfectly timed opportunities for subtle humiliation dressed in pearls and polite laughter. The house was already full when we arrived, the kind of overly curated chaos Margaret prides herself on, a Pinterest-perfect spread of canapes and chilled wine glasses, floral arrangements arranged within an inch of their lives, and a soundtrack of jazz playing at just the right volume to feel expensive, but not intrusive. She was gliding from guest to guest like the social monarch she believes herself to be, doling out hugs with rigid arms and smiles that never reached her eyes. As soon as she saw us walk in, I watched her expression flicker, not enough for anyone else to notice, but just enough for me to feel it. That millisecond of judgment, of calculation, of bracing herself to play nice with a daughter she's never quite known what to do with. Margaret greeted Daniel first, of course, arms outstretched with rehearsed warmth, pulling him into one of those too long, too tight embraces that always makes people watching think she's maternal, affectionate, gracious. But I saw her eyes over his shoulder, sharp, assessing, gleaming with something that wasn't warmth at all. It was that look she's given me since I was 16, the one that said, "Let's see how long this one lasts." "You're brave," she said into Daniel's ear, not in a whisper, but in a half-stage murmur loud enough to ensure nearby guests heard it clearly, settling for our black sheep. And the laughter that followed was the worst part. Not because it was loud, not because it was cruel, but because it was casual. Polite. The kind of thin laughter that makes everyone feel like they're just in on a harmless joke, while you sit there wondering if your dignity just slipped under the table. My spine stiffened instantly, my smile tightening at the edges, and I looked around to see a few raised eyebrows and a few amused chuckles, people who'd known me since I was a teenager. People who had quietly watched my mother undermine me for years and chosen to laugh along because it was easier than confronting the truth of it. And Daniel, God bless that man, didn't flinch. He didn't laugh. He didn't politely nod. He didn't diffuse with charm like most people would have. He simply pulled away from the embrace, took a small sip from his wine glass, and turned to face her completely, his expression calm, composed, unreadable. "Actually," he said, so evenly it almost sounded rehearsed, "your black sheep just bought your mortgage." The words didn't land right away, not in the way most impact moments do. There was a half-beat of silence, that weird dead air that fills a room when something just shifted, but no one's sure which way the floor is tilting. I saw Margaret's smile falter, her mouth caught mid-curled grin, as if her brain was trying to decide whether he was joking or if she'd just misheard him entirely. But Daniel didn't break eye contact. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. And in that second, I felt the entire room tilt. People started whispering, not loudly, but noticeably, and I watched Margaret's shoulders go rigid, her eyes darting toward me, as if she could somehow unhear what had just been said by willing me into silence. But I didn't say a word. I didn't rush in to soften the moment, didn't make a joke to patch over the tension, didn't offer her a lifeline. I just stood there, wine in hand, watching her slowly realize that something had shifted, something she could no longer control. And suddenly, for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one standing in the corner wondering what just happened. She was. There's a particular kind of humiliation that doesn't arrive with raised voices or slamming doors or some public meltdown that people can later shake their heads over and call dramatic. It's far quieter than that, far more calculated, and far more permanent in the way it nests itself in your memory. It's the kind that comes in passing remarks dressed as jokes, in compliments laced with correction, in smiles that twist at the corners every time you dare to step an inch outside the role you've been assigned since childhood. It's the kind of humiliation that's so subtle, so socially acceptable, that no one else even notices it except you, the one who's lived inside it your entire damn life. I was never the daughter my mother wanted, and we both knew it long before I ever had words for what that meant. From the earliest moments I can remember, it was clear that Caroline was the blueprint and I was the deviation, the glitch in the system that Margaret couldn't quite fix, but never stopped trying to. Caroline was neat, polite, charming in that soft-edged, agreeable way that made teachers swoon and neighbors gush and relatives whisper things like, "She's going places." Meanwhile, I was loud without meaning to be, messy in ways that couldn't be explained away, and drawn to things my mother didn't understand, books with dark endings, music that made her uncomfortable, and ideas that made her purse her lips every time I said them out loud. I remember being 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table painting a watercolor that had bled off the edges of the paper, the colors muddy and chaotic, but beautiful in a way only I seemed to see. Margaret walked by, glanced down, and said, "Well, that's different. Maybe next time try coloring inside the lines." And I remember how my heart sank not because she hated the painting, but because she didn't even try to see it. It wasn't just that she didn't like who I was, it was that she didn't believe who I was had value at all. By the time I was a teenager, the comparisons were no longer subtle. Caroline had her straight-A report cards framed and displayed on the hallway wall like trophies. I brought home a short story that won a statewide contest and was told, "That's nice, but you can't build a life on that." Every achievement I had was measured not by its merit, but by how inconvenient it was to acknowledge. Every interest I pursued was met with condescension masquerading as concern. I didn't follow the path she'd envisioned, and in doing so, I became the family's unofficial cautionary tale, the one who made things harder, the one who didn't fit, the one who just couldn't get in line. And yet, somehow, I kept showing up. I kept attending birthdays, holidays, cookouts, all while swallowing back the hurt and smiling through the small jabs, the veiled remarks, the backhanded compliments that were served with the same effortless grace as the lemon bars she baked for every family gathering. I'd walk into rooms where people already had an idea of who I was: lazy, emotional, too independent for her own good, and I'd nod and make polite conversation while my mother steered the narrative with little comments like, "Lena's always been spirited," or "She's not like Caroline, but she's creative." Have you ever been made to feel like your independence was a burden instead of a strength? Have you ever smiled through a family event just to avoid being labeled sensitive? Tell me in the comments. I know I'm not the only one who's had to bite their tongue while someone else told your story in a voice that didn't belong to you. And so, when Margaret made that comment to Daniel at the engagement party, when she leaned in and dropped that little bomb disguised as a joke, "You're brave, settling for our black sheep," she wasn't saying something new. She was simply repeating what she'd said 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways. But this time, she said it in front of an audience. And this time, someone responded. When the laughter broke out around us, that awkward, polite chuckle that people use when they don't know whether to laugh or cringe, Margaret stood a little taller, pleased with herself, thinking she'd gotten away with it again. But then Daniel, steady as ever, lifted his glass to his lips, took a slow sip, and said, "Actually, your black sheep just bought your mortgage." The room stilled like someone had flipped a switch. For a split second, you could almost hear the sound of Margaret recalibrating, trying to decide if this was another joke or a serious blow she hadn't seen coming. Her smile faltered, but didn't fully collapse yet. She forced a little laugh and said, "Oh, he's joking," I scanning the guests as if to reassert control, to pull the narrative back into her hands. But Daniel just turned to her, still calm, still cool, and said, "Not even a little." 2 weeks before the engagement party, before the clinking of wine glasses and veiled insults wrapped in white tablecloths, before Margaret's snide whisper and Daniel's quiet retaliation, there was a moment, quiet, unnoticed, and private, when everything began to shift beneath the surface, like fault lines slowly cracking under pressure no one else could see. It started not with confrontation, not with drama, but with a single question asked in a tone so soft, it barely registered as significant at the time. Daniel had looked at me across our living room one evening, his voice low and casual, almost offhand, and asked, "Hey, do you know anything about your parents' finances?" At first, I laughed, genuinely laughed, because what child ever really knows the financial situation of their parents, especially when those parents have spent decades painting everything with a veneer of composure and control? I shrugged, told him I didn't think there was anything unusual. Margaret had always been meticulous about appearances, the type of woman who would rather skip dinner than admit the dishwasher broke or the roof was leaking. Greg, my father, was even more aloof. He'd managed to float through most of his adult life without ever holding a real conversation about money that wasn't half-mumbled through sports commentary and beer. But Daniel didn't laugh with me. He just nodded slowly, lips pressed together, and gave me that look, the one I'd come to know well, the one he gave when something didn't sit right, when he had noticed something I hadn't, when he was already 10 steps ahead of the conversation. And in that moment, I realized that while I had grown up blind to the cracks in my family's facade, Daniel had been quietly taking notes from the very beginning. Over the course of our relationship, he had sat through more than his fair share of dinners filled with passive-aggressive digs, watched me swallow back hurt disguised as patience, heard my mother deliver backhanded compliments with a smile so polished it could cut glass. He had asked questions, not pushy, not accusatory, just curious, just observant, and I had brushed them off, because that was what I'd been trained to do. That was the script I'd been handed since childhood. Keep the peace, keep your head down, keep pretending everything is fine, even when it's bleeding at the seams. But Daniel didn't grow up in a house like mine. He didn't have a mother who used guilt as currency or a father who stood by in silence because silence was easier than conflict. He knew something was off. He felt it in the way Margaret asked me about my career with a tone that barely disguised her disapproval. He saw it in the way Greg avoided eye contact whenever I brought up money or future plans. And when I told him I didn't know the details of their financial situation, he didn't let it drop. He did his own digging, not out of malice, not out of spite, but because he loved me enough to want the full picture of the weight I'd been carrying without even realizing it. He made a few calls, contacted a friend in finance, asked a few pointed questions that most people wouldn't have dared to ask. And what he found didn't surprise him as much as it confirmed what he already suspected. The mortgage on my parents' house, our family home, the one Margaret loved to parade around during dinner parties and holiday events, had been in trouble more than once. Late payments, missed deadlines, quiet panic hidden beneath immaculate drapes and polished hardwood floors. They had refinanced twice in the last 5 years, and they were barely holding on, pretending to float while quietly sinking. And in true Daniel fashion, he didn't just uncover the truth, he did something about it. He contacted the lender privately, without saying a word to me, and arranged a purchase of the mortgage in full. The paperwork was clean, discreet, completely above board. But he didn't put it in his name. He put it in mine. He transferred the ownership directly into my name. No fanfare, no theatrics, just precision. Just power. He didn't tell me right away. He waited, patiently, letting the plan settle, letting the weight of it build in his mind until the timing felt right. And one night, exactly 3 days before the engagement party, he handed me a folder while we were sitting on the couch, sipping tea and half watching a movie we weren't even paying attention to anymore. I opened it casually, flipping through the documents, not really processing what I was reading until I saw my own name printed on a legal deed that didn't belong to any property I recognized as mine. "What is this?" I asked, my voice suddenly sharp with confusion. Daniel leaned back, folded his hands behind his head, and smiled in that quiet, measured way he always did when he knew a storm was coming and he was ready to walk straight through it. "You're not their black sheep, Lena," he said evenly. "You're their damn landlord." It was 2 days after the engagement party when Caroline showed up at my door, standing there in her beige coat and polished heels like she was stepping onto the set of some family drama she thought she was still directing. I didn't need to guess why she was there. Her face already said it all before she even spoke. That mix of manufactured concern and quiet superiority that she wore like a designer handbag. She had probably spent the last 48 hours on the phone with Margaret, dissecting every second of that party, every syllable of Daniel's sentence, trying to figure out how they'd lost control of the narrative so suddenly, so completely, and so publicly. I opened the door and offered her a seat in the living room, though every part of me knew there wasn't going to be any real conversation, not in the way she'd try to pretend. Caroline never came to talk. Caroline came to manage. She came to steer the story back to something palatable, something that could be digested and wrapped in polite explanation, so everyone could go back to pretending nothing had ever been said or done to offend, belittle, or fracture. But the problem was, this time the story wasn't hers to shape. She sat down on the edge of the couch, legs crossed tightly, her eyes scanning the room in that familiar way, half curious, half judgmental, before she finally turned toward me with that falsely warm tone she'd perfected over a lifetime. "Lena," she said, drawing my name out just a little too long. "I just wanted to check in. Mom's been really upset since the party." I nodded, offering nothing more than a neutral expression, letting her fill the silence the way she always did when she wasn't getting the reaction she expected. She hesitated for just a second before continuing, her voice dipping slightly in that faux compassion register she used when she wanted to sound like she was bridging a gap, but really just laying a trap. "She just feels like maybe it all could have been handled differently," she said carefully, watching me closely. "You know how she is, she takes things so personally." And there it was, the real reason she'd come. Not to clear the air, as she claimed when she texted me earlier that morning, but to shift the blame. To smooth the jagged edges and convince me that I'd been the one to disrupt harmony, that my silence had been the explosion, that Margaret's cruelty had only ever been misunderstood concern. It was a routine we both knew by heart, Caroline as the voice of calm reason, and me cast as the emotional one, the difficult one, the one who always took things too far. I didn't speak, not yet. I just sat back and let her talk. "She's just embarrassed," Caroline said next, lowering her voice slightly. "I mean, Daniel didn't have to say that in front of everyone, did he? You didn't have to let it escalate like that." I let the words settle, not because I agreed, but because I wanted her to hear how they sounded in the quiet, unchallenged. I wanted her to hear herself, to hear the way she always protected the system, always defended the illusion, always turned a mother's insult into a daughter's responsibility to absorb. "Caroline," I said finally, my voice calm, low, steady, "do you even hear what you're saying?" She blinked, her composure cracking for the briefest second. I didn't make her say anything, I continued, my words deliberate now. She wasn't caught off guard. She wasn't misunderstood. She was being exactly who she's always been, and for once, someone in the room didn't let it slide. Caroline's smile faltered then, just slightly, but enough to see the shift underneath. The role she was so used to playing, the composed mediator, the favored daughter, the keeper of balance, was slipping, and she knew it. For the first time, she was realizing that I wasn't just the black sheep. I was the one holding the match near the curtain while the house of illusions they'd spent decades building started to smoke. "You always take things too far," she said, sharper now, that thin layer of kindness finally shedding to reveal what she'd really come to say. "You always push until things break." "No," I said, standing slowly, walking toward the window where the late afternoon light was pouring in like quiet defiance. "I don't push things until they break. I just don't hold them together for other people anymore." She stood too, quickly, brushing invisible lint from her coat like the room itself had left a stain on her. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't hug me. She just walked toward the door, muttering something about how she hoped things would settle down, how maybe I'd come around and see that this all got blown out of proportion. But before the door clicked shut behind her, I reached for my phone, thumb hovering over the contact labeled Mortgage Bank, Private Republic. When the line picked up, I didn't hesitate. "I'd like to activate the transfer clause," I said calmly. "Let's make it official." The meeting wasn't dramatic, not in the way Margaret might have envisioned it. not in the way television families shout and cry and knock over chairs, but it was sharp, precise, and cold in all the ways that cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. It took place in a modest, window-lined office tucked into the third floor of the local branch bank, the kind of place designed to make serious discussions feel professional and transactional, not emotional or explosive. The conference table was sleek, the coffee lukewarm, and the air thick with something far less tangible than tension. It was the heavy weight of reality arriving exactly on time. Margaret walked in first, all clipped heels and forced smiles, trying her best to carry herself like someone in control of the situation, even though she had no idea what she was about to walk into. Greg followed a few paces behind her, hands in his coat pockets, looking like he wasn't entirely sure what day it was, let alone why they'd been asked to attend this meeting. He gave me a half-hearted nod when he saw me already seated at the table, and Margaret offered one of those tight-lipped expressions that wasn't quite a greeting and wasn't quite a glare either. Just that practice mask she wore whenever she felt cornered but refused to admit it. The bank manager introduced himself politely, shuffled a few papers, and offered them both coffee, which they declined. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The folder sitting in front of me did all the speaking for now. When the manager began explaining the updated legal details, Margaret's entire posture shifted ever so slightly, like a statue developing a hairline fracture, small, invisible to the untrained eye, but irreversible. He explained, plainly and without embellishment, that effective as of that morning, the mortgage was no longer under the previous terms. He explained that it had been fully purchased and transferred into private ownership, mine. He showed them the signed documents, the digital confirmation, the notarized paperwork, all spelled out in black and white with a clarity no one could argue. And then he said the words I had been waiting for, the words that felt like air finally being let into a sealed room. Lena Carter is now the legal title holder of the property. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was brutal. Margaret stared at the documents for a moment as if they might rearrange themselves into something more favorable if she looked hard enough. Greg just stared at the wall, detached, distant, as though the gravity of the situation was bouncing right off of him like it always had. Finally, Margaret leaned forward, her voice brittle and thin, like glass about to shatter. "Why would you do this?" she asked, as if the question carried some moral authority. "What is this supposed to prove?" I met her eyes, not with anger, not even with satisfaction, but with the quiet exhaustion of someone who had stopped trying to explain herself a long time ago. "It's not about proving anything," I said clearly. "It's about ending the performance." "You've embarrassed us," she said, voice rising now, the indignation beginning to bloom. "You've taken something private and turned it into a power play. Do you know what people are going to say?" "I'm not interested in what people say anymore," I replied without flinching. "I'm interested in the truth. And the truth is, for years you've held control over me with guilt, expectation, and a story that said I was always the burden. I'm not asking for anything from you. I'm just done pretending." Margaret scoffed, leaning back in her chair with a sneer, trying to regain footing. "So what now?" she asked. "Are you kicking us out?" "No," I said simply, placing another document on the table. "I'm offering you the option to stay under new terms. No more guilt trips, no more quiet manipulation, no more passive-aggressive demands disguised as conversations. Full transparency. And absolutely no financial dependence. You want to stay in that house, you do it on your own merit." Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly wanting to speak, but unsure how to form a sentence that didn't land him in trouble with either of us. Margaret stood abruptly, face flushed and trembling, and for a second I thought she might actually throw something or scream. But she didn't. She just spat out the only weapon she had left. "You've destroyed this family," she hissed, glaring at me like I'd taken a match to her carefully constructed legacy. I stood slowly, gathering the papers into my folder, and looked her square in the eye one last time. "No," I said calmly, without a hint of hesitation. "I just stopped financing it. There's a kind of quiet that doesn't feel heavy anymore, a kind that doesn't carry the weight of unsaid things or the invisible pressure to keep everything smooth and digestible for the comfort of others. It's a silence that doesn't linger like smoke after an argument, but instead settles like warm air at dusk, soft and steady and earned. That's the kind of quiet Daniel and I found ourselves sitting in just a few days after everything had finally unraveled. Or maybe unraveled isn't even the right word, because really, it wasn't chaos that had taken place. It was order, finally. Honest, raw, uncomfortable order that left no room for illusions to keep breathing. We were on the patio behind our house, the kind of evening where the breeze is just cool enough to remind you summer's giving way to something calmer, where the air smells like jasmine and the sky turns that pale orange that always feels like an ending and a beginning at the same time. I had my legs tucked under me on the lounge chair, a glass of wine resting in my palm, and Daniel beside me with his usual quiet presence, the kind of presence that never feels demanding but never disappears either. It was the first time in a long time that I wasn't replaying a conversation in my head, wasn't rehearsing a response, wasn't bracing for the next guilt-laced phone call or backhanded comment passed through Caroline or Greg or whoever else wanted to play mediator without ever asking how I actually felt. We weren't talking much, not at first. There wasn't a need. There's something sacred about sitting with someone who doesn't require performance, who doesn't ask you to shrink or contort just to fit the moment. Eventually, Daniel looked over at me, one hand draped lazily over the arm of his chair, and said, "You know what the strangest part of all this is?" I turned to him, raising an eyebrow, waiting for the punchline. He smiled slightly, then said, "It's how silence doesn't feel like tension anymore. It feels like peace." I nodded, letting those words soak in because they were exactly right. For most of my life, silence had meant danger. It meant something was brewing beneath the surface, a new judgment forming, a fresh disappointment being quietly filed away. Silence meant punishment, meant withdrawal, meant I had failed to measure up again and needed to try harder, smile brighter, comply quicker. But now, this silence? It wasn't cold or foreboding. It wasn't full of landmines. It was just ours. A few moments later, Daniel stood to go inside and grab a blanket. While he was gone, I noticed something tucked between the cushions of the porch chair, a small envelope I hadn't seen before, cream-colored, my name written across the front in that delicate, overly rehearsed cursive that could only belong to Margaret. I stared at it for a few seconds, not because I was afraid of what was inside, but because I already knew exactly what it would say. I didn't need to open it to read it. I could hear her voice already, the tight language of half apologies, the careful phrasing designed to sound like remorse without ever taking responsibility. There would be no real admission of guilt, only suggestions that I had misunderstood or taken things too personally. There'd be a line or two about how family should never be divided, followed by a barely concealed request to reconsider, to fix, to return things to a version that worked better for her. I didn't even hesitate. I walked over to the small fire pit we'd built months ago and struck a match. The envelope burned quickly, curling inward on itself like something ashamed of its own existence. Daniel came back just in time to see the last bit of it dissolve into ash, the corners still glowing faint orange against the night air. He didn't ask what it was. He didn't need to. Instead, he sat beside me again, pulled the blanket over both our laps, and wrapped his arm around my shoulder. Then, after a moment of silence that felt like the cleanest breath I'd taken in years, he said, "You didn't become powerful tonight. You just stopped hiding it." And God, if that wasn't the truest thing I'd ever heard. It's funny how the people who spend their lives calling you difficult, dramatic, selfish, or too much are always the first to panic when you stop bending to make their comfort your responsibility. They call it betrayal when you draw a boundary. They call it cruelty when you finally say no. They call it destruction when all you've done is refuse to carry the weight they never bothered to acknowledge. But power doesn't always come with fire and fury. Sometimes it's just a quiet decision made in your own backyard, with a glass of wine in hand and nothing left to explain. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the loudest. It's the one who finally has nothing left to prove. So tell me, how do you define family when it's never really defined you?